His name is Kemi Seba. He's a Franco-Beninese activist. And for burning a banknote worth $9, the Central Bank of West Africa had him arrested. $9. That's what it cost him. 5 days in Dakar Central Prison, a place he compared to a concentration camp because he burnt a single note. But it's not because the $9 mattered, because what that note represents terrifies an entire system. What if I told you that right now, at this exact moment, 14 African governments cannot set their own interest rate, cannot freely print their own money, cannot devalue their currency during a crisis, and until recently were legally required to store half of their national wealth in a vault in Paris, France. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not propaganda. This is written into international monetary agreements. It is enforced by central banks, and it has survived for 80 years. To understand what is happening today, you have to go back to the rubble of World War II. It is December 26, 1945. France is broke. Her city is bombed. Her economy shattered. On this exact date, France ratifies the Bretton Woods Agreement, the international framework that would rebuild the global financial system, and in the same stroke creates a new currency for its African colonies. According to the Central Bank of West African States, that is the BCEO, the CFA franc was created on December 26, 1945, and at that moment, CFA stood for exactly what it sounds like. France's finance minister as at that time, René Pleven, presented it as an act of generosity. His words exactly, and I'm quoting from the historical records. In a show of her generosity and selflessness, metropolitan France, wishing not to impose on her faraway daughters the consequences of her own poverty, is setting different exchange rates for their currencies. Her faraway daughters, that was the language of 1945. But the architecture it built is still standing. Between 1957 and 1965, countries after countries gained independence. New flags, new anthems, new presidents. The colonial governors packed their bags and left. But nobody touched the currency. To understand why this is such a big deal, you need to understand three things the CFA franc does. Three chains, if you will. From the very beginning, any country using the CFA franc was required to deposit 50% of its foreign exchange reserve into a special account at the French Treasury in Paris. Note that I said French, not the African Central Bank, the French Treasury. And it was actually worse than the 50%. According to research published in the Harvard International Review, member states had to keep 50% for reserves, plus an additional 20% for financial liabilities. That means the nations only ever controlled 30% of their own money. Think about what that means for a president trying to build hospitals, roads, schools. He reaches into his national treasury and 70% of it is in France. Now, here is the moment that should have broken the system but didn't. January 12, 1994. On this Thursday morning, 79 million people across 14 African nations woke up and their money is worth half of what it was the night before. According to the Washington Post, the clearest result was that millions of people in some of the world's poorest nations were forced deeper into poverty overnight. Prices for import goods, rice, medicine, fuel, doubled or tripled. No warning, no vote, no debate in any African parliament. That decision was made in Paris, in coordination with the International Monetary Fund. The men who made it did not live in the countries they were impoverishing. One researcher who grew up in Mali and Senegal described the feelings his parents had, the feeling, the dread of the new hardship to come. As at the time of this devaluation, the CFA franc had been devalued exactly once before in its entire history, in 1948. And now, 46 years later, it happened again. Overnight, 50% gone. The third chain is the most invisible and possibly the most deadly. The CFA franc is permanently pegged to the euro, and before that to the French franc, and at a fixed rate. Right now, 1 euro equals to exactly 655.957 CFA francs. It has been this way since 1999. I am sure you're asking, why is this a problem? Because the euro is designed for the European economy. It was designed for Germany, France, Italy. When European interest rates goes up to fight inflation in Europe, African businesses pay the price. When the euro strengthens, African exports becomes expensive on world markets, which will end up making it harder for African farmers and manufacturers to compete. Critics, including economists at the African Developmental Bank, argue that the franc is overvalued by 10 to 15%. Every day it stays overvalued, African goods are artificially expensive abroad. Every day, local industries can't compete with cheap European imports. You cannot build an industrial economy when your currency is permanently set for someone else's economy. It is an economic ceiling built in Paris. Now, and this is important, the CFA franc did deliver one thing: stability. Historically, CFA countries experienced lower inflation than many of their non-CFA neighbors. No currency crisis like Zimbabwe hyperinflation, no overnight collapse, and for small businesses that trade across borders within the zone, the fixed rate makes commerce simpler. The French government and some African leaders argues these are real benefits. Ivory Coast, for instance, the long-serving president Alassane Ouattara publicly defended the franc as recent as 2017, calling it, I quote, very useful for all of us. But here is the question that never gets answered. Useful for whom? And at what cost to sovereignty? December 21st, 2019, Emmanuel Macron flies to Abidjan and stands next to Ivory Coast president to announce what he calls a historic reform. The 50% reserve requirement finished. French representatives on the African Central Bank boards removed, and the name changed. The CFA franc would become the ECO. African social media celebrated. Headlines said France was finally letting go. But read the fine print. The currency is still pegged to the euro. France remains the guarantors of the value. The 6 Central African CFA countries, nothing changed. They still deposit 50% in Paris. The ECO, as of 2026, it still hasn't launched. The latest target date is July 2027. In December 2024, a French parliamentary committee officially reported the 2019 reform was incomplete. As one analyst put in a Harvard review, a monetary system that holds a former colonial power as the guarantor, regardless of announcement or agreement, will always ultimately fail to eradicate neocolonialism. Something happened in the Sahel between 2020 and 2023 that the international media mostly covered as an instability story. 6 military coups across the CFA franc zone, but if you look closer, you will see a pattern. These aren't random coups. In country after country, the first thing the new military government did was expel French troops. They tear up defense agreement with Paris and start talking about the CFA franc. In 2022, Mali's military government terminated its defense agreement with France, accusing French forces of failing to contain terrorism while interfering in domestic politics. In January 2023, Burkina Faso gave French special forces 1 month to leave, and after Niger's coup in July 2023, the same playbook: expel the French, expel the Americans, and start building something new. By January 29, 2025, despite a last-minute extension offer, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger formally withdrew from the ECOWAS, the West African Economic Bloc, in what analysts called the most significant crisis in West African regional integration since 1975. And at the center of their grievances, the CFA franc. Niger's leaders said it plainly: currency is a sign of sovereignty. It is no longer acceptable for our state to be France's cash cow. On February 15, 2024, Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, now calling themselves the Alliance of the Sahel States, formally announced their intention to leave CFA franc zone and create a new common currency of their own. In November 2024, the Science Center for International Research, one of France's owned elite academic institutions, published a survey. 95% of West Africans surveyed said they want to leave the CFA franc. 95%. In a survey conducted across the countries that use the currency. And yet, the currency remains. The euro peg remains. The French guarantee remains. And for 6 Central African countries, the 50% reserve requirement in Paris remains unchanged. Remember Kemi Seba, the man who burned the $9 notes? He was arrested. He was acquitted on a legal technicality. The law banned burning notes, plural, and he had burned only one. He was then deported from Senegal, turned away from Guinea, and also turned away from Togo. In 2024, France moved to revoke his citizenship. Their stated reason, his criticism of, quote, French presence in Africa as neocolonialism. His response was to burn his French passport live on camera. Your passport is not a bone that you give us or take away depending on how submissive we are to you, as if black people were dogs. I am a free black man. I am a free African. I am a free Beninese. For burning $9 worth of paper that was printed in France, about which France holds veto rights, backed by a guarantee that keeps Africa economically tethered to its former colonizer, this man lost his country. That is how much this currency means to the people who controls it. Here is where it stands right now in 2026. The West African CFA franc still exists, still pegged to the euro. The ECHO replacement currency announced in 2019 still hasn't launched. The new target date is July 2027 if it happens at all. The 6 Central African countries, Cameroon, Chad, Gabon, Congo, Central African Republic, Equatorial Guinea, still deposits 50% of their reserves in Paris. Nothing changed for them. The 3 Sahel juntas have announced a new currency. No one knows if they can pull it off. Creating a currency from scratch is extraordinarily difficult. And France has, according to historical research, actively undermined previous African attempts to do exactly this. Senegal's new Prime Minister, Sonko, stated in May 2025 that the CFA franc poses both a symbolic and economic problem. 210 million people, 14 nations, 80 years. The flags changed in 1960. The banks didn't. The question isn't whether Africa should control its own money. The question is, who gets to decide when that happens? Thank you for watching. Please give us a like if you enjoyed this video and subscribe. I'll see you again tomorrow.